All right, we'll get this going. All right, thanks everybody for being here tonight. Election Eve, it's Christmas Eve, and of a sort, and tomorrow's obviously the big day. So much of the attention is on the national level, the presidential race, the U.S. Senate's on in the balance, Congress. The irony is that, relatively speaking, here in New Hampshire, that stuff is a little less interesting than it is in a lot of other states, generally for good reasons. We don't have a U.S. Senate race on the docket tomorrow. That really opens up a lot of oxygen for other races, including down ballot. I know that we'll look at this in a moment. There's been a little bit of tightening in the presidential race in several of the most recent polls, but not to the extent that it should, I don't think, pose any real concerns for winning the electoral votes. Of course, a tightening at the presidential level does have some down ballot ramifications, and we will get into that in a moment. Uh, and and of course, for Congress, we take nothing for granted, but we have two outstanding political athletes as our two Democratic nominees for Congress. And I think they are unusually young for members of Congress and very talented. And polling suggests that we're in pretty good shape in both of those. We take nothing for granted, but feel pretty good about those, which means that we've been able to put a lot of juice into state level races. It's a really competitive governor's race. Generally, the polling has been very unusually stable, and we'll look at that in a minute. And that has big impact on down ballot races. Joyce, we can say this: it should be pretty close at a minimum, and Joyce will be the most competitive Democratic gubernatorial nominee since at least 2016, it looks like. And I feel pretty comfortable saying that. And that has real positive impacts for a lot of you who are running and will be on the ballot tomorrow and the people you're supporting. And as you'll see in a moment, uh, I feel like we have a great chance at getting the House majority after tomorrow night. And the Senate remains in play, although that is a little dicier proposition, thanks in no small part to gerrymandering and, in a few cases, incumbency. So we'll check that out. But let's start, let's see here, with the data. Always a good place to hang. All right, let's see here. See if we get this. Okay. What I'm gonna do this. Let's see here. Second. This. Right. Open this up. Go. Should do it right here. All right, let's close that up so I can see this. And we are off. All right. So some of you have been on some or all of the prior editions. This is the final one. We'll make a prediction. The cone of uncertainty has gotten a lot tighter with a lot of recent polls that have come in. So we'll get to the nitty-gritty. But first, very, very quick version, because this is such an important part of the conversation, the partisan voter index. It is such an important part of how the model runs. And what it basically does, for those that haven't heard this enough, it takes how your precinct, your town, your House, Senate district, whatever it may be, acts in recent statewide general elections compared to the state overall. And this is the two-party vote. So we take out libertarian, we take out scatter and write-in, and it makes it apples to apples throughout election cycles, the Republican versus the Democrat. And so the percentages you see are slightly different from what you'll actually see tomorrow night for the percentages, because the denominator will be a little bit bigger with write-in, scatter, and libertarian. But entering the 2024 cycle for the last year and a half, this has been the starting point for how the state has been acting recently. Democrats getting 48.64% of the vote in statewide elections, the two-party vote. So this is important because when you've been hearing that a House district is D+3, what that has meant is that it is rounded to the nearest full number. It is acted about 3 points more Democratic in statewide elections than the state overall. So it did not mean 53. It meant 48.64 plus about 3, the exact number depending what it was, but we'd call it a D+3. And that meant it was acting like a slightly Democratic district. It's a critical baseline number because everything is built off around that. So as we got closer to the election, the general election, I was able to see what the actual Democratic baseline would be when we got real polling, especially when we got a lot of it. To keep in mind, districts between the threes down to 0 are highly competitive. Lots of Republicans win R D+2s, Democrats win R+3s, happens all the time. Between the sixes, you get opportunities to swing often, and not as often as the ones closer to 0, but we see plenty of those every cycle. You'll see a bunch of those in a moment tonight. So let's just get right to it. Here's the methodology. We had a ton of polling. I spent a lot of time on the road, meeting a lot of candidates, new and old, in the swing districts. This is the fourth and final running of the model. Way back in August, the first one, we have 3 scenarios: 80th percentile, 50th percentile, 20th percentile. 80th is basically the best reasonable case scenario. And in this one, you can see that the number floated, not a lot, but a little bit as we went through the cycle, as we got more and more polling, as we got towards election day. And I updated this late last night. So you can see Harris, it started low, went up a couple points. This is best case scenario. And we're down now to the best reasonable case scenario would be one where she wins by about 9 points. That's not likely to happen. The polling is tightened a little bit, but 9 is around the 80th percentile of what could reasonably happen. And then you look in the governor's race, Joyce, it's been pretty consistent. Recent polling, 2 or 3 of the last 4 polls have shown a little extra tick for AOT, still within the top of the margin of error, but just a little more. And you can see that it has floated around 52 quite a bit. In early October, you could see that was probably the peak of what the model suggested could happen. And right now, the best reasonable case scenario is that Joyce would win by about 3 points. This is, again, of the two-party vote. So it would be about a 3-point victory. That would be anything beyond that means that we're getting outside of margin of error. It would be not impossible, but it would be like a 2006 tsunami kind of year. And if that happens, then these numbers only get bigger. The good news is in the highest reasonable case scenario, you can see it's a very good night for Democrats, about 230 House seats, and we're looking at a majority in the state Senate. To give you context, the model spit out in each of these scenarios. In version 1, the ceiling was 227, then 239, then 236, and it is now at 230. So it is higher than it started back in August, but it has come down a little bit because the top of the ticket, its ceiling appears to be just a little bit lower, but still a very good ceiling. This is the most likely, if I had to bet $1 on the most likely single scenario, it is not likely to be exactly this, but this is the neighborhood. It would be something like this. You can see that Harris's number has gone down a little bit from the high of the last month. It's, to be quite precise, about 53.2. The most common result in the modeling has Joyce down by about 3. But again, margin of error in a lot of these polls has been 3 to 4 points. And these races have consistently been about a 3-point deficit. So the model projects the most likely outcome would be about a 6-point win in the in the presidential here in New Hampshire, and Joyce on the bottom of margin of error down by 3. But there are many scenarios where these numbers move a little bit. Oh, let's see here. Uh, can folks, I want to make sure that we don't have a problem here. Can folks see the screen? Yeah, okay, good. Hopefully it's not a big problem. To be honest, I'm not sure how I would fix it. I'm glad you can see it. In this scenario, Democrats in most scenarios win the House and come really close in the Senate. That 208, you'll see in a moment, the cone of uncertainty, the kind of margin of error, represents the dead center of the cone of uncertainty. So, in the most likely scenario, if it were to happen exactly like this tomorrow night, Democrats would win the House with a high 200, somewhere around 208 or so. We would win at least 11 state Senate seats, have a real chance at 12, and have an outside chance at a majority. Go. Whoop. Sorry about that. Let me put that back. I had a little hiccup here. There we go. Okay. Uh, in the 20th percentile, this is the worst reasonable case scenario. I want to be clear. This is not likely to happen, but it is on the bottom of things that it would not be crazy based on margin of error, based on all the data we have, but it would be the bottom before we'd say, wow, the polling was completely crazy. You can see the number's been very consistent for a long time on this. The floor has gotten very high, which is great for Democrats. So on this one, Harris wins New Hampshire by only about 3. There have been some recent polls that suggest it's tightening. This would be bottom of the margin of error kind of stuff. And it shows in this worst case scenario that Joyce would lose by closer to 8. This is unlikely to happen, but would be if indeed Ayotte is up 3 or 4 for real in these polls, and the margin of error is 4. That basically would represent the bottom for us of margin of error. And even if that happens, Democrats would still win 186 seats, and we would, in all likelihood, keep the Senate seats that we have. To be honest, there are a couple of seats that we do have that, if this scenario occurred, the model suggests some scenarios where either Donna Soucy or Shannon Chanley's seats would become extremely competitive. But I want to make it very clear: these are not likely scenarios, but they are not impossible. They would not be completely out of left field. Now I'm going to show you the same chart in 2 different ways because I don't want people to freak out. Here's what the Democratic baseline has looked like since the general election, basically the last month and a half. You can see that it got to a high point of about 51.5% for Democrats um, in early October. It was before Donald Trump got a little bit of momentum in the month of October. And also it showed a couple of polls where Joyce was tied. There was one poll that even showed her leading by a point. So it reflected a pretty high Democratic baseline. In the last few weeks, in part because Trump has shown a little bit of momentum that I think is flattened out over the last 10 days, as well as some stabilization on the gubernatorial polling. The number has gone from a high of about 51.5 down to the high 50s, so about 50.83 in the most recent one. But I know that chart looks like it's a steep drop, but notice it's in a very narrow range between about 50.8 and 51.5. And to give it additional context, here's where it started this summer. I included the August model projection that had us down even lower than in 2022. And you can see that consistently the models suggest that we're going to do between 2.7 and 3.4 points better than what the original model showed. And that's a huge difference. And as you'll see, that's the difference between everything needing to go right to get a majority, like almost happened last time, and not and having a lot more margin of error down ballot to be able to get majorities, particularly in the House. This has been the actual election day Democratic baseline in the last 4, and then tonight's final number. You can see this would be at 50.83% expected Democratic performance at the top of the ticket tomorrow. That would be the highest since 2014 when we had Maggie Hassan getting reelected governor and Jeanne Shaheen winning a tough reelection against Scott Brown for US Senate. So we have not had a Democratic baseline as strong as the one that we're poised to have tomorrow in a decade. A lot of this is because of the strength of Chris Sununu. You can see in 2016 where Hillary Clinton narrowly won and Colin Van Ostrom narrowly lost and Maggie Hassan narrowly won. It was about as close to 50% as you could get. So 16 through 22 represent the actual baseline. And of course, we don't know what 2024's will be, but as a way to compare, and that should give you some wind in your sails. We are poised to have a night that I think for the down ballot will be the best in at least a decade when you look at the environment. Here's the path to a House majority. The model, and I do, this is one place where I layer it in with qualitative analysis. I've spent a lot of time with a lot of you and many others and really sought to understand on the margins in these multi-seat districts where the delineation, where the line of competition is. Right now, it looks like Democrats have about 178 seats that would be described as either safe or likely. They're in a strong position. The GOP has about 168 that would fit that classification. And that leaves about 54 seats. Of those 54 seats, if the projection is exactly right, and it never is exactly right in terms of the Democratic baseline, we would be favored in at least 30 of the 54 seats that are not in the likely or safe category. We could do better than that. We could do worse, but you should feel pretty good. That would, and of course, 178 plus 30 would put us at 208, which again is what the most frequent median projection is. So basically, in the seats that are potentially competitive or they're definitely competitive, we are favored in the majority of them, at least 30 of the 54. So if things hold, this is the headline version that gets us to that 208. And you can see getting to 201 in a majority means getting pretty deep into the light red territory. And indeed, I believe that we're going to do that tomorrow. So here's the nitty gritty. If the Democratic statewide candidates approach the current baseline, if it happened to be exactly what is projected tonight, Democrats would win between about 197 and 219 House seats with a dead center of 208. In 2022, for context, it was a slightly wider cone of uncertainty at that point, and the midpoint was 197 and a half, which is exactly what we did. We won 197 and we tied, so I count that as a half, 197 and a half. I would love to be as precise. It probably won't be, but the dead center of this is 208. So just to think about it, 2 years ago, the dead center was 197 and a half. The dead center in the model right now is 208. So we start in a much stronger position, 10 and a half seats more to the good, which means that we have a little bit more margin for error. We don't have to win 2/3 of the jump ball seats. If we win a little bit more than half of them, we should have a majority with a little bit of room to spare. A couple people can afford to get sick, which on a given day, which has not been the case the last 2 years. So here are the key 43. I advertised it this morning. My email is 42. I added one more after doing some more work. The House candidates, based on quantitative, qualitative measures, likely to be in the closest races. Many of these have been in the bullseye for many months. Frankly, some of these districts were in the bullseye last cycle in 2022. So these are ordered from the most Democratic House district to the most Republican one that are in this key 43. Generally speaking, these are.
You probably didn't know about Princess Charlotte in less than a minute. Charlotte is known for her confidence and fearlessness in front of the cameras. She was named Charlotte Elizabeth Diana of Cambridge.
I think somebody may want to mute, or else we're going to hear a lot about Charlotte. I digress. Here we are. So we don't have to go through all of them. This may be one of those where, and I will put this up as soon as this is over. I'm recording it as we speak. I will put it up on the YouTube channel right after. So I would say within roughly a half hour of when this is done, you can go on, review this. Um, you can email me tonight or tomorrow. I'm tentatively hitting the road to visit a number of these districts. If I can do it, I'll deliver coffee and donuts for some of you, and thank you profusely, and put some miles on the car. But they will be in districts like this, and let's see. Oh, can you scroll down? Yeah, actually, these are on different pages. So I'm going to go to different pages here, and I'll show you. Let me clean up my own screen here for a moment. So you can see the bluest one, Greg Sargent, Merrimack 7, that is Dan Wolf, who is retired. Greg is favored in most scenarios. Greg flips the second seat, but because it is Dan Wolf is very active in that race, trying to help a strong Republican non-incumbent. We don't take that for granted. That's one obviously early in the night we want to see. You see a few from Coos County, and anything in Coos County is a threat because of the steep move towards Republicans, generally speaking, in Coos County. You're going to see on this list a ton of Manchester seats. That is probably the single biggest variable in this entire election, in my opinion, for the state house, certainly, and to some extent, maybe even for governor, because there are scenarios in the model where Joyce dramatically overperforms in Manchester, which would increase her chances of winning, but also would drag in more Democrats for House in districts that are rather purple, that are moving in some cases very dramatically to Republicans, and in some cases, like in Hillsborough 19 up here, you can see that Suzanne and Sam, neither of them are the incumbent. It's a district that's a D+2. It's moving rapidly towards Republicans. We had two very popular veteran legislators, Heidi Hammer and Jane Beaulieu, both retired. And although we have strong candidates, it makes it a more vulnerable seat, which is part of why they're on the list and part of why I'll be keeping a close eye on Hillsborough 19 tomorrow. You can see Rochester in a number of places. Amy Malone is in the closest to dead zero of any House district in the state of New Hampshire. Entering election day is an R plus 0.09. It is as close to dead zero. But here's the point. If the state acts at 50.83% Democratic performance, that means that generally speaking, all of these numbers will also move about 0.8 of a point towards us. It will be a net friendly scenario for Democrats by an additional 0.83, to be very precise about it, which means look at Amy Malone, look at Ben Baroudi and Maxine Mosley, look at Alan Blair in Hampton, look at Barry and Allen out in Swansea. Those are very marginally Republican seats that if the net statewide environment is even slightly Democratic, all of a sudden these seats move critically into the blue by a little bit. Of course, that's why we have campaigns. People can overcome, deficits of several points, but you'd rather be in a Democratic leaning or a Democratic acting district. And it takes all of these very light red ones that are theoretically blip opportunities or vulnerable ones for our incumbents, and it just adds a little breathing room. So all these ones that are around, R1.5, R1, all the way down to zero, what happens at the top of the ticket is so critical to get that fourth seat in Rockingham 29, which is Hampton, to get both seats in Hillsborough 39 in Manchester, to get Amy's seat in Rochester, and so forth. So that's it. So let's go to the next page here. We have some Cheshire seats that are really important. Kristen Tilton, again, that one may actually be slightly Democratic performing tomorrow. Paul Dargy, who has a great chance of picking off the second seat. We need that one to have the two seats. Jen Ramsey, one of the most exciting races, a great new candidate. out in Western New Hampshire and Sullivan, and you can keep going down the list. Chuck Grassi tied last time. You can see it's going to be almost a dead zero if the Democratic performance is what I project. I can keep going down. Anything with Hollis is pretty competitive. Karen is in a flotarial that includes some less friendly towns to go along with Hollis, which is why her seat is on the list. And the Hollis only two-seat district is not on the list. Um, so we have that. You can see, I saw Gary Merchant uh, chime in a moment ago. The third Claremont seat, I feel the model shows in virtually all scenarios, we definitely get two of them. We are very likely to get the third seat, but that's one of those that hopefully pretty early in the evening tomorrow, because of the nature in a presidential year. Claremont, there are scenarios. If Trump overperforms, it probably means he's overperforming in places like Claremont and Berlin. If we find in Claremont pretty early in the evening that it is acting like the model projects it will, Democrats, that means that we're almost certainly going to pick up all three seats. You have a fourth Merrimack seat in the town of Merrimack. We put some time and money, a really important district, wonderful candidates. We have a great chance at the fourth seat. This is again, if Harris is performing at more like the median model as compared to the lower end model, there's a lot of suburban seats like Milford, like Hollis, like Merrimack, where Democratic performance should be strong and where we have a great chance in those suburban districts. Here's some more of the seats. Very bullish on picking up at least one seat in that New Boston, Mount Vernon, Lineborough district. I think we can pick up at least one seat in Jaffrey. That's a Jaffrey Dublin Ringe district. Ringe prevents it from being a light blue. But we got great candidates working hard there. You see a couple more Rochester seats right there, Stratford 19. Tim Egan up in the Littleton area. We have a great chance to pick up a second seat there. I feel really good about one. The model shows we get one in virtually any scenario. That would likely be Linda Massimia. Tim is probably our best obvious shot to pick off a second seat. You can see with Hope Damon, the model shows Hope is probably in pretty good shape, good enough shape to be off the list on the good. Cody would represent a net pickup of a seat. Goffstown, go Goffstown, shows a real opportunity to pick up a second seat. And if we perform closer, a little above the 50th percentile, have a decent chance at maybe even picking off a third seat. And now we get to some of the reddest seats that make the model because of unique circumstances. I'm pretty bullish on Carroll 3 tomorrow. I think that's one that's been under the radar screen. There was really good recruitment, excellent local committees. It's Madison, which is getting blue very quickly, Tamworth, which is getting blue quickly, Moultonborough, which is quite red. But when you put it together, it has moved inside the zone of competitive. It's an R 5.6 with really strong qualitatives going for it. The local committee, the strong candidates, the door knocking. I've been in constant contact. They're doing the work. I think that one we have an opportunity. If we were to win that seat, it probably suggests it's a very good night, and it means we're picking up the vast majority of the seats on this list. A few more. We have an opportunity to pick up a seat in Wolfboro. I don't put a name because we have two strong candidates with two somewhat different profiles, but we have a real chance to pick up one there. Bedford is the fourth reddest district that has a Democratic, at least one Democratic rep right now. It has two. We have a real chance to pick up a third, maybe even a fourth. Again, if Harris is doing well in the suburbs, Bedford is a very obvious town that should be a beneficiary of that. And then we have three of the most difficult to hold seats: Mark Vallone in Epping, Al Turcotte in Allenstown, Charlie St. Clair in Laconia. These are three holds that if Trump is overperforming, if it looks like he is, if Harris is winning by 3 instead of 7, it takes seats like Mark, Al, and Charlie, and it makes their job just a little bit harder because of the likelihood that it means that Trump is bringing in extra points in districts like that. Let's see here. Um, you know what? Before I get into the Senate, which is a much cleaner and easier, just because there's so many fewer seats, let me take any questions. I'm going to stop sharing here for a moment. And let's let's take any questions. Keep in mind, if your district is not on this list, it is there's a pretty good chance it is because it is actually in a relatively good place. I'm checking Cheshire. Let's see here. Uh, Oh yeah. So that's an interesting one. Somebody asked about Cheshire 12. Jack Geddens is running. Fitzwilliam, Troy. It's about an R 2.6. And it is, I mentioned that there were about 50, I think I said 54 seats that were not in the lock it in with either party. I did not put all of them in. I'm glad somebody asked. 12, Cheshire 12 is one of the seats that is in the pool. I did not put it on this list, but I will be keeping an eye on that one. And it is not inconceivable that we could compete and win in that one as well. So there are a few that I did not put on the list, but that doesn't mean that they're not theoretically in play. And yes, I think that's one that, frankly, this probably stretches the limits of my knowledge on the ground. A vulnerable incumbent would obviously go a long way to making that one really competitive. Before we get to the Senate, were there any other seats? Were there questions about some of the things you just saw? Somebody just asked, what were the other 11 or so of the 54 House seats up for grabs? I'll be honest, I'd be going off of memory at the moment, which, although I take pride in being pretty good at this stuff, is probably pushing the limits of that. Okay, look at that. Somebody just asked, what about Hillsborough 35? Oh, yes, Kat. I wonder why she's asking. So, Kat McGee, Will Walker. It actually is off this list in the good way. And the main reason for that, and I see Kat, and Kat's kind of like, yeah, that's a good story. Everybody, you always got to worry about your race. Always act like you're 5 points behind. But the reality is, there are a number of districts, Hollis is one of them, where the trajectory of partisan behavior is moving so fast in a Democratic direction that as long as we're not at a 46%, 47, like some of those that you saw earlier from past cycles, it would be extremely unlikely. I'll put it to you this way. If Kat and Will aren't winning their seat in the Hollis only district, then 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 it's not going great tomorrow night. That it would mean that there are several dozen seats that we got to worry about, and now all of a sudden we're back down at that 20th percentile or maybe even lower. So you should sleep a little better, Kat and Will, with that knowledge. There was a question. Let's see here about, let's see. Oh, what do you expect turnout to be tomorrow and down ballot fall off? The It is wholly possible that turnout will be a little bit lower than we've seen in some recent presidential cycles. You've probably heard us talk in past live streams before. We're in an unusual place in terms of the partisanship. For most of the last 30 years, the higher the turnout, the better for Democrats. Up to at least right now, nationally and in New Hampshire, the higher the turnout, probably the better for Republicans. The thing that makes me go probably and not definitely is that New Hampshire's demographics are unique from much of the country. The reason why higher turnout is probably good for Trump in places like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania is because lower engagement voters who tend to be below the median income, tend to be below the median educational attainment, they're going hard for Republicans right now because Republicans are better connected on issues of cost, inflation, and immigration. That's where the connection is. In New Hampshire, we have a very high median income. We have one of the highest percentages of households with at least one college degree. We don't have a lot of, relatively speaking, blue collar. low engagement voters. And so it is possible in New Hampshire that the higher turnout is, the more high education, high income voters that end up showing up. I would argue most of them are already planning to show up tomorrow. And so I would expect turnout to be not record high, uh, but it's always pretty good here in New Hampshire. It could be close to 70%, and that's not a record up here. Let me see here. Yes, Doreen mentions we have boomer women. It's a good point. We have fewer. We're the oldest or second oldest state in the country. Our median age is in the high 40s. It's around 49 years old. Why is that? It's not because the median is that not because we have a bunch of 12-year-olds walking around. We have very few children in the state. Just look at our school enrollment numbers. It's because and we don't have a ton of 80-year-olds walking around. We just have a lot of Gen Xers and young boomers walking around. And interestingly, every poll from Ann Selzer in Iowa to the New York Times Siena poll, the generation that is the most consistently conservative voting right now are Gen X, which is to say, generally people born between about 1964 and about 1980. It's the smallest generation in the country relative to the people ahead and before us. But in New Hampshire, we have one of the highest percentages of Gen Xers of any state in the country because we have a lot of people that move here once they get established. It's cheaper than Boston. The housing's expensive, but it's cheaper than living in Wellesley. And if they can live up here, they don't pay the income tax. It makes it for a very attractive place for a bunch of 50-year-olds to come and finish raising their kids. So we have unusual things with our demographics. I'm going to go back now and share. Here we go. I'm going to go back and let's talk about the Senate. Again, it won't be uh, as detailed because there just aren't as many seats. Here's where we're at. Democrats have 10 seats that in the median, anything close to the median model, are likely to safe. The 10 we have are in pretty good shape unless it's a really tough night. The GOP has 9 seats that are likely or safe under the current model. If we get to the 80th percentile model, 1 or 2 others start creeping in. That leaves 5 seats. And they're the same seats that generally we've been talking about for many, many months. We're going to look at them briefly in a moment. In tomorrow, 1 to 2 of them would be favored in the exact median environment. I'm going to put them in order in a moment of the 5 districts. There are a couple others that, if it nudges a little higher, get really interesting. And then there's a 5th one that, if we get closer to the 80th percentile, if the polling is off and we're a few points, if Harris is winning by high single digits, if Joyce wins, then all 5 of these seats become squarely in play, and that's how we get the majority. So, in order, at least by the model, right now, the most likely seat to get picked off would be District 9. It's Matt McLaughlin running against Denise Ricciardi. Matt has run a model campaign in a lot of ways. The district is galloping in a Democratic direction. There are other Senate districts on this list that have a similar PVI, where the candidate also has raised a lot of money and has worked hard. But the momentum of this district is so fast, thanks in no small part to Bedford and New Boston, which together make up more than half the district, that it really takes a high quality candidate like Matt and puts them in a real position. I mean, I cannot overstate how important Bedford and, in its own smaller way, New Boston are in tomorrow's elections. It's a real bellwether of how things are going to go statewide because of the suburban influence, because of what it means for the state Senate, the opportunity to pick up seats in Bedford and the New Boston-based district. So that is almost certainly our best shot to flip a seat in the current model. The second best shot, and this is a little different, it's the momentum is moving towards Democrats, to be sure, but not as fast as Matt's seat. This is Ben Ming's seat. Some of you may have watched the video on my YouTube channel. I sent an email out over the weekend about it. If you haven't, and you have a few minutes, it's about a 9-minute video that explains why this may end up being the deciding seat. District 12 may become lucky 13. It is only R+2. If the state acts about a point in the Democratic, like more like a 51% Democratic environment tomorrow, that makes this seat not R+2, but R+1. And then likely over the 2 years, it has moved another quarter to half a point towards Democrats. All of a sudden, we're beginning the exercise as an R plus a half a point, R plus 2/3 of a point. And now we have a campaign. Avard has never broken 52%. He's never gotten less than 49.5%. There's a real opportunity in Hollis and Brookline for us to win this seat tomorrow. I've spent some good time with Ben recently. I think we can win this seat tomorrow. Hollis is another one of the most important. Think of Hollis as like Bedford and Brookline as like New Boston. They're actually quite analogous in that regard. This, at the beginning of the cycle, I would not have said was our third best opportunity, but it probably is. It's an R+3.2. It's slowly moving towards Democrats, not as fast as the first two. Stu Green has proven to be a very capable candidate who appears to be a very good match for the district. Dan Innes is not well known in the district. I've seen internal polling that suggests that this really is a coin flip race. The resources have been there. Innes was kind of late to appreciate the threat that Stu Green is to his Innes's reelection. Dan only moved to the district about 3 years ago. This is a very competitive seat, and if the model is off a little bit on the low side, if it's more like 52%, 51.5, 52% Democratic performance rather than 50.6, 50.8, this seat gets really interesting. And again, if we win these 3 seats and we hold the 10 we have, that is the most obvious path to a majority. But here's another seat that has gotten really interesting. It's an R+3, just like some of these others. But look at this. Matt McLaughlin, it's a 3.1, R3.1, but it's moved half a point in the last 2 years, and probably it's moved another half a point since 2022. If you compare that to this, you see the PBI entering the cycle almost identical to the 100th of a point, but it's moved half a point towards the GOP. That's probably the main reason why Rusty is not much closer to the #1 flip opportunity. It's nothing to do with Rusty, who has been an outstanding candidate, truly one of my favorite candidates of the cycle. He has a real chance to win. Kerry Gendro, usually being the incumbent, would make it easier to win. If Gendro had run again, this might have been our best flip opportunity out of the chute because she had so much baggage for a lot of anti-LGBTQ and other, really, she co-sponsored a 15-day abortion ban. I mean, nasty stuff. She stepped down. Dave Rochford is a Littleton-based state rep who has plenty of his own baggage, social conservative type baggage, but obviously is not the incumbent, which makes him a little tougher of a target. But Rusty has done a great job with it. He's been well-resourced. He has knocked on a ton of doors, given how big that district is. No small feat. The biggest thing here tomorrow is going to be, can Democrats hold their own in the greater Berlin area, Berlin-Gorham, or does the Trump effect kind of take down because of the Trumpification of big parts of Coos County? And then the other part is northern Grafton County, which is moving Democratic. It's growing compared to Coos County. Will it be a big enough part of the overall vote in this district for Rusty to be able to pull this out? I'm going to be very excited to watch this one throughout the night tomorrow. And then Bill Marsh, interesting district. Bill, a unique candidate, which gets it on the list. It's R about 4.4. It's been slowly moving towards Democrats, mainly because of North Conway and the northern part of the district. Jeb Bradley retired. That opened the door for this seat. Mark McConkey is a longtime state rep. from more the central part. I think he lives in Freedom, and a formidable candidate to be sure, but no Jeb Bradley. Bill has unique Republican background, friends on both sides of the aisle. He has a record of accomplishment and distinction in the legislature. A physician, which is the PACO scores show that's a really good place to start for crossover vote. This one's going to require Ayotte is likely to do well in District 3, which means that Bill is being asked to overperform by a fair amount tomorrow. If somebody can overperform and get a lot of crossover votes, a lot of Ayotte Marsh split ticket, Bill has the profile to pull it off. And if the top of the ticket does its job and keeps it in the ballpark in District 3, then I think Bill has a chance at pulling off the upset. These are the five most obvious opportunities. So you can see um, it's an easier description for the Senate because of the finite number of targets, but there's a lot of sensitivity on the model here. If the top of the ticket isn't doing 50.8, if it's doing 51.5, that may not sound like a big deal, but an extra half a point, three-quarter of a point at the top of the ticket, especially in Ben Ming, Matt McLaughlin, and Stu, those three in particular, man, you talk about that could be the difference. And I really think Rusty and Bill are uniquely good matches. So that's the state Senate. A quick word or two about the Executive Council. Some of you have heard me talk about this before. I spent a lot of time trying to understand. Um, I think that after this election cycle, a real job, and I hope it goes very well tomorrow, but it wouldn't change what I'm about to say. I think that there is a ton of work to do, a lot of room to improve in the way that we think of executive council races. There I think that applying too often, we sort of treat them like they're state Senate races in the way that we approach them, the way that we budget for them, the way that we think about door to door. And it's just not really applicable, in part because the districts are just too big, geographically too big. And it's a fifth of the state. We're talking about over 250,000 people at this point for each of the five districts. And so you almost have to treat it maybe a little more like a congressional campaign and a little less like a state Senate campaign. Now, what's the problem? The problem is, and this has been proven in the data, that you'll see about 98% participation tomorrow, 98 to 99% of people that walk in the ballot box for president, for governor, for Congress. And of course, it would be Senate, but we don't have US Senate. Then they get to Executive Council, and there's about a 5-point drop off. And then you get to State Senate, and it goes right back up as if governor, right to 98 again. So these are, and by the way, and then for single seat House districts, it stays right there at 98. Where you see drop off at the bottom is multi seat House districts. And you've probably heard this before. That's another frontier that I think there's opportunity for Democrats to win additional seats by thinking more about why between about 5 and 10% of people drop out when it's a multi-seat House district compared to a single seat House district. There's a lot of seats we'd win if we could just get those people to complete all of the Democrats on the ballot, because they're clearly voting for Democrats on the rest of the ballot. It's not a partisan thing. It's what the heck you mean vote for four people? I don't do that because they've never heard that before. It's weird. It is weird. Executive Council is very odd to them. It's the one position that we have to explain what the heck the job is. And then we have to convince people to vote for one of them. You can get people to either persuade them to vote for you or motivate them to turn out. But if you add a third job, educate them about what the heck the job is, well, you see what you see, which is you see drop off. You see one other thing. More than any other position in state politics, the relationship between how the governor does, the nominee, does in an executive council district is almost exactly 1-to-1 with how the executive council candidate will do. I can give you examples like Charlie St. Clair from Laconia is one of my favorite. He outperformed the generic Democratic performance in Laconia by over 9 points in 2022. It's what allowed him to win the seat. Now, why? Well, he's the executive director of Motorcycle Week, which is a pretty good way to outperform your numbers by 9%. But he doesn't have to explain what the heck a state rep is. People assume it's like Congress for New Hampshire, right? Like they get it. Executive council, it is very hard to find examples of outperforming your governor's candidate by 2 points. 2 points. The only two in this century that have done that are Ray Burton in the North Country, who was sort of an icon, and it was a different time, to be honest, and Chris Pappas, who is an amazing political athlete. And there's nothing like being the home of the chicken tender, that was able to outperform it when he was an executive counselor for a couple terms, just like he's going to win by 10 points tomorrow for Congress in a seat that should be one of the 10 most competitive in America. And he's on cruise control for the same reason. These are unique people with unique brands. There's nobody running right now on either side of the aisle who has the Chris Pappas or Ray Burton brand. And that's not a diss on anybody. They're outliers. So take Emmett Soldati. I love Emmett. Emmett's been working his butt off. Joyce probably is going to have to win his executive council district with at least 52% of the vote for Emmett to have a real chance to pull it off. And that is hard because of the nature of the district. This is where the gerrymandering really comes in. Except for Karen Leote Hill's Super Blue district, the other four districts are Republican leaning. They have Republican PBIs. And so basically, Joyce, I would bet a mortgage payment that Joyce is going to win by quite a bit in Karen's executive council district tomorrow. She will win that. She might get 60% of the vote in that district. She'll get 58. She could get 58% of the vote in that district. But that's a waste, right? Because they don't give Karen a second seat on the executive council because she won it by a lot. This is expert gerrymandering. And so my advice for the other executive council candidates, which I've said to their faces, generally speaking, is help the gubernatorial candidate whenever they're in your district, because the better she does, almost to a one-to-one extent, the better you will do. And that's also part of why I spend my time on state Senate and state House, because there's just a lot more evidence that the work that I do and all you do, the donors that give money to help these candidates, the volunteers, we can move 2, 4, 5, 6, 7 points sometimes of performance down ballot in a way that, frankly, I just don't think I can do and others can really do in the same way for executive council. So it's a long-winded answer, but I think it's important because it's not a lack of importance or a lack of respect or affection. It's being stone cold with the data and to be able to go back to the people that ask for advice, that give money, that give their time. I have to be able to give them an honest answer, and that's a very honest answer. And if Joyce does well tomorrow, then we could win several additional seats. We could get the majority if Joyce wins tomorrow. Let's see here. Let's see. I'm looking for other questions that I apologize. I fell behind during that answer. Let's see. Okay, yeah, there was let me just make sure here. Yeah, Rockingham 1. I'm very excited about Rockingham 1. The model suggests that we're going to hold the one seat that we already have, but we have a real chance to pick up at least one additional seat. That's another one of those. It actually looks a lot like that Hillsborough 42, that New Boston-based district. It looks kind of like the Brookline. There are a number of these districts, these multi-seat districts they're not suburban. They're kind of one tier away from the suburbs. We'd call them exurban in other parts of the country. And those are moving towards us pretty quickly. And I think we could win another seat there. A question about Janet Stevens here on the Seacoast where I live, the chances of unseating her. If we win a second seat tomorrow, the one I would bet the money on would be that one. John Morgan is the Democratic candidate. I know Janet quite well. My wife and I have, known her for many years, served on boards here on the Seacoast with her. I'm not here to besmirch people personally and all that kind of stuff, but here's the reality on the numbers. Janet has the lowest PACO score of any of the Republicans running again. That is to say, Wheeler, Joe Kenney, and Janet are the three Republican incumbents running again. And what that means, the PACO score being low means, is the others appear to get some additional benefit beyond what a generic Republican candidate would get in their districts. Not a lot, but a few extra points, which makes a really difficult job even harder. Janet gets no additional bump, especially once you get away from the seacoast, the Rye, Portsmouth, Hampton, Northampton area. She appears to get no more of the vote in, say, Salem and the commuter zone part of the district than a generic Republican who had not run before, who had no name ID that just put their name on the ballot. She's sort of the definition of generic Republican candidate. And that's important because we need those couple of extra points to have a real chance to win that seat. I also think John is a really good candidate. He's a state senator for a term in a pretty purpley part of the district, the middle of Rockingham County. He's raised very good money. He's been working hard. He has some degree of name ID than the typical non-incumbent executive council challenger. He has a chance. And I think that if we do win a second seat tomorrow, I think he would be the first person I'd guess that would win the second seat. And then after that, it depends even more on Joyce. Let's see here. Other questions. There was okay. Grafton 5. Let me just pull that up quickly here. Let me see what I got here. So the challenge in the near term with Grafton 5 is, as I think Dustin and Rachel probably know, it's really red. It entered the cycle at about R+8. Now, quite a while ago, I think early this year, I was up in Littleton and we did some programming on the Senate district. I think that's before we knew Rusty was going to run. And we actually ended up talking about Haverhill a little bit. It's one of the biggest towns in that entire state Senate district. And I would argue it's probably one of the biggest towns in the state that I never hear anybody talk about as an important part of a political strategy. It's a pretty big town. And until recently, we didn't have a ton of infrastructure there either. So it was kind of languishing as sort of pretty ruby red and staying that way. That's beginning to change in no small part due to Dustin and Rachel that are putting work in. So I'm here to be honest. That is an extremely difficult. It would require Joyce to win beyond the 80th percentile, and it would probably require Harris to win by close to double digits, which is not impossible, but at the moment appears unlikely. In order for races like that to come into view, the last time we had an election cycle where a district like that kind of plopped in was 2006. That was the second midterm of George W. Bush. It was a pure anti-Iraq war. It swept in Carol Shea Porter into Congress, all that sort of thing. So that's the answer there. But Haverhill is one I'd like to invest time in 25 because I think that moving that even less red opens a lot of doors, obviously down the line for the New Hampshire House. It would help a lot in Rusty's race if Haverhill was, not so scary. And I'll keep an eye on that tomorrow, especially now that we've talked about it for 3 minutes. Jim O'Connell for executive council. That is an example. Again, with Joyce, the Manchester element is the single biggest variable of down ballot races. One thing that gives me some hope is early in the general election, Ayotte and the Republicans thought the best attack on Joyce was to call Manchester a hellscape. If you watch the ads in the second half of this general election cycle, they've largely gotten away from that. And now they're doing the thing they always do: tax and spend, income tax, income tax. Now, To be fair, that message, and I've talked to Republican friends of mine who've seen some of the numbers, that has had some stickiness. That has worked a little bit. That may explain the couple of extra points that Kelly may be getting here in the last 2, 3 weeks of polling. But the good news is that from a Manchester perspective, I think Joyce may be able to overperform out of Manchester, and that has a lot of downstream positive impacts. Some of the state rep races that I mentioned in the list, uh, the and the executive council. I mean, for Jim to win, he's going to need Joyce to really just cash it out in Manchester. If the Republicans had nominated some of the other people that ran for that seat, they had a vibrant primary. This would be even more interesting. I will give the Republicans credit at a time when they often will nominate people like Lily Williams and Bob Burns and Caroline Levitt, and like they'll often nominate the wildest candidate with no mainstream cred. But they on this one, John Stephen, they got probably their best matchup for the general election, which makes the task a little bit harder. Melanie Levesque spent a lot of time with Melanie in the last few weeks. Melanie spent some time. Oh yes, David Trumbull. I'll mention Dave in one moment. Melanie, if there was a third seat that we win, I said, obviously Karen's going to win. John would be the second seat. I think Melanie might be the third seat. She has moved her messaging in the last few weeks in more of an economic message, which I think is the right move. She has name ID, right? She's been a state rep. She's been a state senator. Dave Wheeler has a couple of points of PACO score because he's been around so long that people kind of know the brand. They don't know what the brand is, but they know what the name is. There's no evidence that Dave Wheeler has a certain kind of brand beyond just, I know that name, which is a little better than if it was somebody who was a beloved high school football coach for 30 years, this sort of thing. So if there's a third seat, but again, I keep going back to Joyce is going to have to perform well tomorrow to help bring those seats home. Dave Trumbull. So I love Dave. The PAC has given some money to Dave. We spent some time in various communities there with hoping to lift in House and Senate races. The biggest challenge for the challenge and the opportunity. The challenge for Dave, it's about an R plus R 5.9 district. It's pretty red. It's on the fringes of what you might see somebody win in a Democratic tsunami kind of year. Another example where if Harris and Joyce are ringing up the score, it takes take an R plus 6. Now all of a sudden the state is acting, let's say in this scenario, 2 to 3 points Democratic. It's taking an R6, moving it to like an R3 or 4, and now we get to the campaign. I can give you examples of Democrats winning districts acting like an R plus 3.5. I can't give you a lot of examples of them winning if the district's acting more like an R plus 6. Even an R plus 5 is not impossible. The good news for Dave, first of all, Dave, I mean this. If Dave Trumbull, if every voter got to spend 15 seconds with Dave, the guy'd be governor tomorrow. He has a likability factor that is among the best of any candidate I know in the state, and I mean that. The problem, of course, is that's not usually the opportunity we get as candidates. So his opponent is in her mid to late 80s, is not an active candidate, and Ruth Ward is basically banking, not unlike David Wheeler and Melanie's race, on you've heard of me, so vote for me again. So she is voting on a red district. She's banking on a red district and an incumbent name to get her to the finish line. I frankly thought she wasn't going to run again. I don't know whether or not that would have helped or hurt because it would obviously depend on the replacement. So that's the reality there. Another seat that I sometimes mention in the same breath as Dave is Carlos Cardona in the Lakes region base seat. It's not only Laconia, but it includes Laconia. Carlos is about as energetic a candidate as you're going to get. And he's running against, this is where I try to be objective. He's running against a candidate who is obviously far more conservative than I'd like, or most of us would like. But generally speaking, has avoided some of the worst moments that some of the down ballot state house candidates in the Republican Party in that part of the state, like a Don Johnson, for example, have just some of the most outrageous, anti-Semitic and just hateful stuff. He's dodged some of that residue, as best as I know, and that obviously helps. And it's a pretty red district. Also, Carlos has struggled with resources, and that's one where I think the party would have to go in hardcore early and spend a ton of money, and that is easier said than done. But those are two that if we had a 2018 style wave year, a 2006 wave year, we'd be spending a lot more time talking about Carlos and Dave's races, I think. Let's see. Any other questions here? I want everybody to get rest, you know. Let's see here. Okay, I see a question about tomorrow night. I'm going to send an email late tonight or super early tomorrow. This is not the time to sleep. Uh, I may be doing a road trip during the day tomorrow to highlight in real time about a half dozen different races. I'm trying to figure out timing with different candidates. I've got some people that have offered to volunteer in some of those places. So as soon as we're done, I'm going to see if I can connect them, mainly for visibility at polling locations where the candidates do not have the coverage for all the towns, and we may have some opportunities to help with that. If you know of anybody, if you or anybody you know is in that kind of boat, send me an email. And I can't promise, but it's a pretty good email list. It's about 12,000 people that are pretty active, most of them in New Hampshire, and a lot of them are asking, how can I help? And if some of them can match up, then that's kind of exciting. Um, and then tomorrow night, it'll be last minute. There may be some kind of a live stream sort of thing. One of the piece of feedback I've gotten is a lot of the kind of folks like you who would watch something like that will possibly not be in a position to watch something like that. You may be at a watch party. You may be helping with polling and the ballots. You may be at the Puritan back room enjoying Chris Pappas's reelection and those great chicken tenders. So we'll see if you'll see an email. If we don't do that tomorrow night, then there'll be towards the end of the week a first cut at what just happened. And then one last thing, as we get deeper into November, December, and certainly early 25, already starting to set up a number of much more full debriefs for your areas. It'll take a while to take all these numbers and figure it out, but 2026 doesn't start in January 26. 2026 starts on Wednesday. You may want to take a break, but some of this stuff starts the day after the next election. So that's the attitude. So if you're interested in that for your local or county committees, let me know, and that's the kind of thing we can do. Okay. Any last questions? I don't see anything. All right. Thank you guys for all you're doing. Some of you are running, you're working. It's awesome. Thank you so much. I may see some of you on the road tomorrow if you're in a purple district. And keep a look at your email, and we'll see what we got. And thank you all again. I'm very excited for tomorrow. I think it's going to be a good night for us down ballot. Okay, guys. Thanks so much.